If they cannot call Emily my wife with respect, they will not touch a cent of what I built." The attorney's voice was calm when he read that sentence, but the room changed as if someone had opened a window in the middle of winter. Margaret Carter's perfect posture collapsed by an inch. Richard Carter stopped tapping his expensive pen against the polished conference table. Susan, who had spent the last hour whispering about vacation homes and company shares, suddenly went still. And in the corner of that quiet law office in downtown Chicago, Emily Carter sat with her hands folded in her lap, wearing the same black dress she had worn to her husband's funeral 2 days earlier, wondering if she had heard the words correctly. For 16 years, Daniel Carter's family had treated her like a temporary mistake. Not a wife. Not a daughter-in-law. Not family. Just Emily, the woman Daniel had brought home from a small town outside Springfield, the woman they believed had never belonged in their world of private clubs, charity galas, lake houses, and Sunday dinners where silverware was arranged like a test she was meant to fail. At Christmas, they placed her at the far end of the table, between a visiting cousin and an empty chair. In family photos, Margaret would always say, "Let's get one with just the Carters first," and somehow the second photo never happened. At Daniel's company events, Richard introduced her as Daniel's wife with the same tone a person might use for an unfortunate delay at the airport. Emily learned to smile through it. She learned to lower her eyes when Susan corrected the way she pronounced a wine label. She learned to pretend it did not hurt when Margaret discussed Daniel's future as if Emily was not sitting 3 feet away. Daniel noticed. He always noticed. In the car afterward, he would reach across the console and take her hand, his thumb brushing over her wedding ring as he said, "One day, Em, they'll understand exactly who you are." But one day kept moving farther away. Then Daniel got sick, and the Carter family's true feelings became impossible to ignore. They visited when doctors were in the room. They asked questions about insurance, board control, accounts, and whether Daniel had updated his estate papers. But when the hospital room grew quiet at 2:13 in the morning, when the machines hummed softly and Daniel needed someone to help him sit up or remind him he was not alone, it was Emily who stayed. She slept in a vinyl chair for weeks. She drove 22 miles each way to bring him the soup he could still taste. She read to him when his eyes were too tired. And on the last clear afternoon they had together, Daniel looked at her with a tired smile and whispered, "I should have protected you better." Emily had told him not to worry about that. She had meant it then. At the funeral, Margaret had placed a hand on Emily's elbow and gently moved her from the front row, saying, "Family should sit together today." Emily did not argue. She simply stood behind them as they accepted condolences for the man she had loved, the man whose name they claimed, the man whose final words were now turning their confidence into fear. Mr. Harris adjusted his glasses and looked across the table. "Mr. Carter was very specific," he said. "This condition applies to every property, every investment account, and every voting share of Carter Development Group." Richard's face tightened. "That can't be legal." Emily finally lifted her eyes. For the first time in 16 years, no one in Daniel's family was ignoring her. Emily did not smile when Richard said those words. She did not lean forward. She did not defend Daniel, and she did not defend herself. For once, she did not need to. Mr. Harris placed the will flat on the table and turned one page with careful fingers, as if every sheet had been prepared for this exact silence. Across from Emily, Margaret Carter pressed a tissue to the corner of her eye, but there were no tears. There had rarely been tears from Margaret unless someone important was watching. She had built an entire life around appearances, from the white columns of her house in Lake Forest to the charity luncheons where she spoke about family values while leaving Emily out of every invitation that mattered. Emily remembered the first time Daniel took her there, 16 years earlier, when she was 26 and still nervous enough to smooth her dress every few minutes. The Carter home had looked like something from a magazine, with a long brick driveway, trimmed hedges, and a dining room large enough to make every voice echo. Daniel had squeezed her hand before they walked in and whispered, "Just be yourself." Emily had tried. She brought a homemade apple pie because her mother had always said you never entered a home empty-handed. Margaret accepted it with 2 fingers, smiled politely, and said, "How thoughtful. We usually have dessert catered." That was the first cut, small enough for everyone to pretend it was not a cut at all. By dinner, Richard had asked Emily where she went to college, and when she said she had attended community college for 2 years before working full-time to help her parents, Susan had tilted her head and said, "That must have been very practical." Daniel heard the insult beneath the sugar, but Emily touched his knee under the table, silently asking him not to make the night worse. She believed then that kindness could soften people. She believed time would show them she was not after Daniel's money, his last name, or the Carter place in Chicago society. But time did not soften them. It taught them where to press. At birthdays, Emily was asked to help in the kitchen while the others discussed family investments. At Thanksgiving, Margaret gave her serving spoons and told her she had such a natural way with simple things. When Daniel received a business award at a hotel downtown, Emily stood beside him in a navy dress she had saved for months to buy, only to hear Susan whisper that it was "sweet how hard she tries." Daniel had wanted to leave that night. Emily made him stay because his speech mattered, his employees were there, and she refused to let their cruelty steal something he had earned. That was the part the Carters never understood. Emily was not weak because she stayed quiet. She was disciplined. She was loyal. She knew when silence protected peace and when it protected someone she loved. In those early years, Daniel was not the polished success his family liked to claim. Carter Development Group had been struggling. 2 projects had stalled, 1 bank had pulled financing, and Richard had already suggested selling part of the company to outside investors. Margaret called it a temporary embarrassment. Emily called it a problem they could survive. She spent nights at the kitchen table with Daniel, sorting invoices, reviewing tenant letters, and helping him call small contractors who still trusted him. She packed his lunches when he skipped meals, drove across town to deliver documents when his assistant quit, and once sold the diamond earrings her grandmother had left her so payroll could clear before a holiday weekend. Daniel had cried when he found out. Emily had simply told him, "People are counting on you." Years later, when the company was worth more than anyone in that law office wanted to admit, Richard told people Daniel had rebuilt it through Carter instinct. Margaret said it was in the blood. Susan said success returned once Daniel stopped being sentimental. No one mentioned Emily. No one asked why Daniel kept a framed photograph of her on his desk instead of a family portrait. No one noticed that at every major decision, Daniel looked toward Emily first. Now, sitting under the soft lights of Mr. Harris's office, Emily understood that Daniel had noticed everything they refused to see. He had noticed every insult she swallowed, every door closed in her face, every moment she chose grace when anger would have been easier. Richard leaned back in his chair, trying to recover his confidence. "There has to be more context," he said. Daniel was emotional near the end. Mr. Harris looked at him without blinking. Mr. Carter made these instructions while fully competent, witnessed by 2 physicians and recorded on video. Margaret's tissue stopped moving. Susan's lips parted slightly. Emily felt her wedding ring against her palm as her fingers curled. For years, the Carter family had treated her like a guest in Daniel's life. But Daniel had left behind proof that she had been there all along. Mr. Harris reached for a small black remote on the table, and for the first time since the meeting began, Margaret Carter looked frightened. Not grieving, not offended. Not disappointed, but frightened in a way Emily had never seen before. It was the kind of fear that arrived when people realized the room no longer belonged to them. Richard straightened his tie and forced a laugh that sounded too dry to be natural. "A video is unnecessary," he said. "We all know what Daniel wanted." Mr. Harris turned toward the flat screen mounted on the wall. "Your brother made it clear that he did not believe you did." The sentence landed softly, but it seemed to drain the air from Richard's chest. Emily sat still as the screen came to life. Daniel appeared in a navy sweater, thinner than she remembered from better days, seated in the sunroom of their home in Evanston. Afternoon light rested across his shoulders, and behind him was the maple tree Emily had planted the first spring after they moved in. Her breath caught when she saw it. That tree had been a little taller than her when they bought it, and Daniel had teased her for reading 3 gardening books before choosing the right spot. Now it filled the window behind him, strong and golden, as if it had been waiting to stand witness. Daniel looked into the camera, not like a businessman giving instructions, but like a husband trying to finish a promise. "If you are watching this," he said, "then I am gone, and Emily is sitting in a room with people who may still not understand what she meant to my life." Susan lowered her eyes. Margaret clutched her tissue so tightly it wrinkled into a thin white robe. Daniel continued, his voice tired but steady. "For years, my family believed Emily came into my life after the hard work was done. That is not true. She was there when the company nearly failed. She was there when I was too proud to admit I was scared. She answered phones, balanced invoices, sat through meetings she was never thanked for, and gave up things she loved so I could keep building a future everyone else now wants to inherit." Emily closed her eyes for 1 second. She had never wanted those sacrifices listed like evidence. At the time, they had simply been marriage. The kind of partnership no one sees because it happens in kitchens, hospital hallways, quiet cars, and late nights. When the rest of the world is asleep. Daniel's image paused for a moment as he took a careful breath. "I allowed too much silence," he said. "When my mother dismissed her, I softened it later instead of correcting it then. When Richard spoke around her like she was furniture, I changed the subject. When Susan smiled at her with pity instead of respect, I told myself Emily was strong enough to endure it. She was strong. But strength should not have been the price of loving me." Emily felt her throat tighten, but she did not look away. For 16 years, she had told herself Daniel's private love was enough. The hand on hers under dinner tables, the quiet apologies in the car, the flowers left beside her coffee after difficult family weekends, the way he always came home to her no matter how loud the Carter name became. But hearing him admit the truth in front of the people who denied it made something inside her shift. Not break. Not heal completely. Just shift, like a locked door finally opening a few inches. The video continued. Daniel spoke of the year his father died and Margaret refused to let Emily help with arrangements, even though Emily had spent 2 nights organizing old photographs because Daniel could not bring himself to do it. He spoke of the company gala where Emily had written half his speech, then stood alone near the coat check while his family posed for press photos. He spoke of the hospital weeks, when Margaret visited with fresh lipstick and stayed 20 minutes, when Richard asked about voting shares before asking how Daniel felt, when Susan brought flowers and placed them where nurses had to move them 10 minutes later. Then his expression softened. "Emily never asked me to choose between her and my family," he said. "That is why I am choosing now." No one moved. Even the clock on the wall seemed too loud. Emily looked across the table and saw Richard's jaw tighten, not with sorrow, but calculation. She knew that look. She had seen it at dinner parties whenever a conversation turned to money. She had seen it when Daniel closed a deal Richard wanted credit for. She had seen it the day Daniel named an outside executive to manage expansion. Instead of giving Richard control. Margaret leaned toward the screen, her voice barely above a whisper. "Daniel, what did you do?" But the recording did not answer her. It only continued with the calm finality of a man who had prepared for the moment they would try to rewrite him. "To my family," Daniel said, "you may receive what I have left for you only if you can do one honest thing. You must acknowledge, without conditions and without performance, that Emily Carter was not an outsider to my life. She was my partner, my equal, and the reason much of what you value still exists." Mr. Harris paused the video. The room stayed frozen. Emily could hear traffic moving far below the office window, ordinary people crossing downtown Chicago without knowing that in one quiet room, 16 years of humiliation had just been placed under a bright, unforgiving light. Mr. Harris let the pause stretch long enough for everyone to understand that Daniel had not left behind a request. He had left behind a line they could not step around without revealing exactly who they were. Richard reached for the glass of water in front of him, but his hand stopped halfway, as though he had suddenly remembered that confidence was supposed to look effortless. Margaret turned from the screen to Emily, and for the first time that morning, her expression was not polished enough to hide the anger underneath. "Emily," she said carefully, "surely you understand Daniel was very emotional. He loved dramatically near the end." Emily did not answer. The old Emily might have softened the moment. She might have said something gentle to help Margaret save face. She might have reminded everyone that Daniel wanted peace, not tension. But the old Emily had spent 16 years paying for peace with pieces of herself, and she had no pieces left to offer. Mr. Harris resumed reading from the document. In addition to the recorded statement, Mr. Carter provided a written history of contributions made by Mrs. Emily Carter to Carter Development Group and to his personal estate. Richard's chair made a small sound against the floor. "Written history?" he asked. "That sounds excessive." Mr. Harris looked down at the page. "It is detailed." Then he began. He read about the first winter after Emily and Daniel married, when Carter Development Group was close to missing payroll and Emily took a temporary bookkeeping job at a medical office during the day, then came home and helped Daniel organize invoices until midnight. He read about the $20,000 from Emily's private savings, money she had built before marriage, placed into the company account during a cash shortage. He read about the sale of her grandmother's earrings, not as a dramatic gesture, but as a documented contribution Daniel later repaid with interest into an account Emily never touched. Susan shifted in her seat. Margaret looked toward Richard as if expecting him to deny it. Richard could not. The numbers were there, the dates were there, and Daniel had left no room for their favorite habit of calling Emily's sacrifices sentimental stories. The attorney continued, his voice steady and professional, but each sentence seemed to uncover another room in a house the Carters had claimed to know. Emily had helped review lease agreements when Daniel was too exhausted to focus. Emily had spoken with tenants who were angry, contractors who were nervous, and employees who were afraid the company would close. Emily had driven 140 miles in a snowstorm to deliver signed documents to a lender outside Milwaukee because Daniel's car would not start and the deadline was 9 o'clock the next morning. Emily remembered that drive. She remembered the white lines disappearing under blowing snow, the gas station coffee that tasted burnt, and Daniel calling every 15 minutes, apologizing until she finally told him, "Stop saying sorry and stay awake with me." They had laughed then, not because anything was funny, but because laughter was sometimes the only way to keep fear from filling the car. None of the Carters had known that story. Or maybe Daniel had told them and they had chosen not to remember. Margaret's voice tightened. If she did all of this, why did Daniel never say so? Emily looked at her then. Not with triumph. Not with bitterness. Just with the tired honesty of someone who had carried the same question for years. "He did," Emily said softly. "You did not listen." The room went still again. Richard's face flushed, but he had no quick answer. Susan stared at the table, tracing one fingernail along the edge of a folder she had not opened. Mr. Harris turned another page. Mr. Carter also included his medical directive records and visitor logs from Northwestern Memorial Hospital. At that, Margaret stiffened. Emily's stomach tightened, not because she was afraid, but because those weeks were still tender in places money could not touch. Daniel's illness had reduced the Carter family to schedules and appearances. Margaret visited on Tuesday afternoons after lunch with her friends, never staying long enough to hear the difficult updates. Richard came twice with a leather folder and once with a question about whether Daniel had considered transitioning voting rights before surgery. Susan brought flowers, perfume, and stories about people Daniel barely knew. Emily brought clean socks, lip balm, soup, insurance forms, and the quiet courage to sit beside a man who was slowly making peace with goodbye. Mr. Harris did not describe the pain. He did not need to. The record spoke plainly. Emily had signed every caregiver form. Emily had attended every consultation. Emily had been listed by Daniel as his primary contact, medical decision partner, and the only person authorized to hear every update. Margaret looked smaller in her chair now. Richard looked trapped between greed and embarrassment. And Emily, who had walked into that office expecting to be invisible one more time, began to understand that Daniel had built this moment carefully, not to shame them for sport, but to place the truth where they could no longer decorate it, dismiss it, or push it to the end of the table. Mr. Harris closed the medical file and let the quiet settle again, but this time the silence no longer belonged to grief. It belonged to exposure. Emily could feel the difference in the room. Before the video, before the records, before Daniel's careful words had begun unfolding like a map, the Carter family had sat around that table as if they were waiting for a business transaction. They had dressed for it too. Richard wore a charcoal suit and a silver watch that caught the light every time he moved his wrist. Susan had arrived in pearls, her handbag placed neatly beside her chair, her expression fixed in the soft sadness people wear when they know others are looking. Margaret looked as she always did at important gatherings, elegant, composed, and certain that her name would carry her through any uncomfortable moment. But Daniel had prepared for more than their manners. He had prepared for their memory. "There is one more section before the distribution terms," Mr. Harris said. Richard looked toward the ceiling as if asking for patience from something above him. "How many sections did he write?" "Enough," Mr. Harris said. The answer was not rude, but it ended the question. He opened a blue folder and removed several printed pages. Emily recognized Daniel's handwriting immediately, even before the attorney explained what they were. The letters were slightly slanted, the way they became when his hand grew tired. She remembered him writing at the small desk near the bedroom window during those final weeks, sometimes covering the page when she came in, telling her with a weak smile that he was only organizing his thoughts. She had believed him. Or maybe she had chosen to believe him because there were already too many things to fear. Mr. Harris began to read. Daniel had written about the funeral. Not as a man imagining ceremony, flowers, or music, but as a man who understood exactly what might happen when he was no longer there to hold Emily's hand. "If my family attempts to place Emily outside the role she held in my life, let this document correct them," Mr. Harris read. "She is not to be moved behind them, spoken over, introduced as an attachment, or treated as a guest at my goodbye." Emily's breath caught so sharply that Susan finally looked at her, but Emily kept her eyes on the table. The words reached backward 2 days and touched the place where the insult still lived. The front row at the funeral had been reserved with white cards. Margaret Carter. Richard Carter. Susan Carter. Family. Emily had seen her own name on a chair near the aisle, but before she could sit, Margaret had approached with that careful smile that never reached her eyes. "Emily, dear, I think it would be better if immediate family sat together today. You understand." The pastor had been speaking with someone near the entrance. Guests were arriving. A few employees from Carter Development Group had already turned toward them. Emily had felt every pair of eyes without looking up. She could have said, "I am his wife." She could have said, "I was the one beside him when he stopped being able to climb the stairs." She could have said, "Your son asked for me every time he opened his eyes." Instead, she had stepped back, because she did not want Daniel's funeral remembered for a scene. She stood behind the row of people who had taken his last name for granted and listened as they accepted sympathy meant for the love she had lived. Richard shook hands like a board chairman. Susan dabbed her eyes at the right moments. Margaret leaned into every embrace as though she had been the center of Daniel's world. Emily received condolences from nurses, employees, and one elderly tenant who had driven 50 miles to tell her Daniel once forgave 3 months of rent after her husband died. That woman held Emily's hands and said, "He told me you were the reason he knew mercy mattered in business." It was the only moment that day Emily almost broke. Now, in Mr. Harris's office, Daniel's written words brought that moment back with a force she had not expected. Margaret's face hardened. "I was grieving," she said, as if grief explained everything. Emily finally turned toward her. "So was I." The words were quiet, but they crossed the table with more weight than anything Emily had ever said to her. Margaret looked away first. Mr. Harris continued, reading Daniel's instruction that any challenge to Emily's position as surviving spouse would trigger an immediate review of all conditional gifts. Richard leaned forward. "Conditional gifts," he repeated. "You keep saying that." Mr. Harris nodded. Because Mr. Carter's estate plan is built around them. Susan's voice softened suddenly, almost sweet. Emily, none of us want this to become ugly. It was the first time she had used Emily's name without a sharp edge. Emily heard the change immediately. So did everyone else. Daniel had been right. The moment money became uncertain, their tone began to change. Mr. Harris placed one final page in front of him and said, "Then I suggest everyone listen carefully to the next paragraph." Mr. Harris looked down at the final page, and Emily noticed that even he seemed to slow before reading it, as if Daniel's words carried more than legal weight. Outside the window, Chicago moved on in its usual rhythm, cars sliding through the late-morning traffic, office workers crossing streets with coffee cups in hand, the city unaware that inside this conference room, an entire family was being measured against one simple standard they had avoided for 16 years. Mr. Carter wrote, Mr. Harris began, that my estate shall not be distributed according to blood alone, because blood alone did not sit beside me in fear, rebuild what I nearly lost, or love me when there was nothing convenient to gain. Richard exhaled sharply through his nose. Margaret closed her eyes as though the words were indecent, not because they were cruel, but because they were true in a room where truth had become the only thing with authority. Mr. Harris continued. To my mother, Margaret Carter, I leave the Lake Forest house and the annual maintenance trust prepared for it, provided she signs a written acknowledgment that Emily Carter was my wife in every legal, personal, and moral sense, and that she is to be treated publicly and privately as the surviving head of my household. Margaret's eyes opened. The Lake Forest house was more than a home to her. It was the stage on which she had performed the Carter legacy for decades, the place with white columns, oil portraits, imported rugs, and a dining room where Emily had been made to feel smaller than the silver candlesticks. Emily remembered standing in that doorway every Thanksgiving, holding a casserole Margaret had never served, watching the family arrange itself around traditions that somehow never had a place for her. Now Daniel had tied that house to the very respect Margaret had withheld. Mr. Harris turned to the next line. To my brother, Richard Carter, I leave a minority distribution from my personal investment portfolio and the option to purchase certain non-voting shares, provided he acknowledges in writing that he knowingly dismissed Emily's contribution to Carter Development Group and agrees not to challenge her authority over my controlling interest. Richard's face changed immediately. There it was, the part he had been waiting for and the part he feared most. Control. Not memory. Not love. Not even money first. Control had always been Richard's hunger. He had spent years circling Daniel's company like a man admiring a house he believed should have been his. At dinners, he questioned Daniel's decisions with a smile. At family gatherings, he used phrases like when we restructure and after we bring leadership back inside the family, even though Daniel had never promised him anything. Emily had seen Daniel grow tired after those conversations, not angry exactly, but disappointed in the way only a younger brother can be when he finally understands that admiration and envy have been wearing the same face. Mr. Harris read on. To Susan Carter, I leave a personal gift from my charitable fund in recognition of her public service work, provided she ceases any social or public misrepresentation of Emily Carter's role in my marriage, my illness, or my estate. Susan's mouth opened as if she might object, then closed again. Emily knew why. Susan cared deeply about social circles where reputation traveled faster than facts. She had made a hobby of turning Emily into a polite little story, the quiet wife who did not quite fit, the small-town girl who never learned how things were done, the woman Daniel loved in spite of better options. Now even that soft cruelty had been named. Mr. Harris set the document down for a moment. Each of these conditions must be met within 30 days. If any party refuses, contests the will, or attempts to pressure Mrs. Carter into altering the terms, that party's gift is revoked and transferred into the Emily Carter Foundation, which Mr. Carter established to support family caregivers and widowed spouses. Emily looked up then, startled. The foundation was new to her. Daniel had never mentioned it. For a moment, the legal office disappeared and she saw him again at their kitchen table, wearing reading glasses he pretended not to need, scribbling notes when he thought she was asleep. He had not only defended her. He had built something from the pain she never wanted anyone else to carry alone. Margaret's voice came out thin. He named it after her? Mr. Harris answered without hesitation. Yes. Richard leaned forward, his mask almost gone now. And the company? That was the question everyone had been waiting for. Mr. Harris picked up another page, but this one he did not read immediately. He looked at Emily first, as if giving her the dignity of a warning before the world beneath the table shifted. Mr. Carter's controlling shares in Carter Development Group, along with the Evanston residence, all primary accounts, and all decision rights attached to his personal estate, passed directly to Mrs. Emily Carter. Susan's pearls moved slightly as she swallowed. Margaret stared at Emily as though seeing a stranger who had been sitting in the room the whole time. Richard's voice dropped. That is impossible. Emily heard herself breathe, slow and steady. She had not come there wanting a company, a house, or the power to decide anyone's future. She had come for the final piece of Daniel. But Daniel, careful Daniel, guilty Daniel, loving Daniel, had made sure that the people who once pushed her behind them would now have to look at her before they could reach anything he left behind. Richard's words hung in the room with the weakness of a man who had run out of facts and was reaching for disbelief. Mr. Harris did not argue with him. He simply placed another document on the table and slid it forward, stopping it just short of Richard's hand. Mr. Carter anticipated that response, he said. The transfer of controlling shares was completed through a living trust 6 months ago. The will confirms the distribution, but the authority has already been assigned. Richard stared at the page without touching it. For years, he had acted as though Daniel's company was a chair being kept warm for him, something he would eventually claim once Daniel became too tired, too sick, or too sentimental to resist. Now he was being told that the door had not only closed, it had been locked before he arrived. Margaret turned toward Emily again, but the anger in her face began to reorganize itself into something softer, something practiced. Emily recognized the transformation because she had seen it at charity events when donors approached, at weddings when photographers came near, and at hospital doors when nurses entered with updates. Margaret Carter knew how to become gentle when gentleness served her. Emily, she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound wounded, Daniel clearly trusted you. No one is denying that. Emily almost looked behind her, as if the words had been meant for someone else. No one is denying that. 16 years of dinners, holidays, funerals, business galas, hospital rooms, and cold introductions rose in her memory like a long hallway of closed doors. They had denied it in every way that mattered. They had denied it with seating charts, with whispers, with missing invitations, with family photographs where her absence was treated as natural. They had denied it when Daniel was alive and able to be hurt by it. Now that his estate stood between them and comfort, they were willing to rename the past. Susan leaned forward carefully. I think what Margaret means is that we all made mistakes. Grief makes people behave imperfectly. The word grief sounded strange in her mouth. Emily looked at Susan's pearl bracelet, the same one she had adjusted at the funeral while asking whether the Evanston house had already been appraised. Richard finally picked up the document, scanned the first page, and his face tightened line by line. This gives Emily final approval over the board transition, he said. Mr. Harris nodded. Yes. And hiring decisions connected to executive leadership. Yes. And the right to remove family members from advisory positions if those positions are not tied to measurable duties. Mr. Harris folded his hands. That is also correct. Susan's expression flickered. Margaret sat back, no longer pretending to cry. Emily understood then that Daniel had not merely left her wealth. He had left her protection from being cornered, managed, or politely robbed by people who knew how to make greed sound like family concern. Richard looked at Emily for the first time as if she had substance, as if she were not a shadow beside Daniel, not a quiet woman at the edge of a photograph, but the person holding the pen. Emily, he said, and the sound of her name in his voice felt newly expensive, you know the company. You know how much Daniel cared about legacy. We should work together on this. She remembered another time he had used that phrase. We should work together. It had been 8 years earlier, when Daniel was recovering from a minor procedure and Richard came to the house with a folder of proposals. Emily had made coffee, set out sandwiches, and sat nearby in case Daniel needed anything. Richard had spoken for 40 minutes about restructuring company debt, then looked at Daniel and said, "We need serious people in the room for this." Daniel had told him Emily stayed. Richard had smiled and said, "Of course, but you know what I mean." Emily had known exactly what he meant. She knew now too. Mr. Harris cleared his throat. "There is an additional personal letter addressed to Mrs. Carter. She may choose to read it privately, but Mr. Carter requested that the first paragraph be read aloud before any discussion of settlement, challenge, or negotiation." Emily's hands tightened in her lap. A personal letter. For a moment, the company, the shares, the house, and the conditions all faded behind the ache of Daniel's handwriting waiting on paper. Mr. Harris opened the envelope with care. His voice softened as he read. "My Emily, if they are being kind to you now, listen closely to why. The people who could not honor you when they thought you had nothing may suddenly discover manners when they learn you hold everything. Do not confuse that change with love." Susan looked down. Richard stopped moving. Margaret's lips pressed together. Emily felt the sentence pass through her like a hand reaching across time. It was not bitter. It was not cruel. It was Daniel telling her one final truth in the only way he still could. Mr. Harris continued. "You do not owe anyone access to your peace simply because they are related to me. You do not owe them forgiveness on a deadline. You do not owe them the comfort of pretending they were better to you than they were." Emily blinked slowly, refusing to let the room have her tears. For years, she had believed loyalty meant absorbing pain quietly so Daniel would not have to choose. But Daniel had chosen. Not against his family, not exactly. He had chosen the truth. And now that truth sat in the center of the table, calm and undeniable, while every person who once ignored Emily waited to see whether she would save them from the consequences of their own hearts. Emily did not answer immediately, and that was what seemed to frighten them most. For years, her silence had been useful to the Carter family because they mistook it for permission. Silence meant they could seat her at the end of the table and call it tradition. Silence meant they could leave her out of photographs and call it timing. Silence meant they could speak around her, over her, and through her, then comfort themselves with the idea that she was simply quiet by nature. But this silence was different. This silence had weight. This silence belonged to a woman who had finally realized no one in the room could decide her place anymore. Mr. Harris placed Daniel's letter gently in front of her, but Emily did not reach for it yet. She looked first at Margaret, then Richard, then Susan, taking in their faces with a calmness that surprised even her. Margaret was the first to adjust. She leaned forward, softened her eyes, and folded her hands as if she were sitting across from an old friend instead of the daughter-in-law she had spent 16 years treating like an inconvenience. "Emily," she said, "I want you to know that I never meant to make you feel unwelcome. Families can be complicated. I was protective of Daniel, perhaps too protective, but that came from love." Emily listened. She remembered Margaret telling a neighbor at a Christmas brunch that Daniel had always been too generous with broken things, then glancing toward Emily as if the meaning were harmless. She remembered Margaret correcting her table manners in front of 12 guests when Emily reached for the wrong bread plate. She remembered the hospital afternoon when Margaret stepped into Daniel's room, saw Emily asleep in the chair beside him, and whispered to Richard that exhaustion did not make someone noble. Now Margaret spoke of love because love was less expensive than honesty. Richard cleared his throat. "I agree with Mom," he said quickly. "There were misunderstandings. I should have included you more in business conversations. That is on me." The phrase sounded rehearsed, modern, and empty. Emily almost felt sorry for him. Richard did not know how to apologize without trying to manage the outcome. "Daniel trusted you," he continued. "And if he trusted you, then of course we do too. We just need to make sure the company remains stable. Employees are counting on that. Families are counting on that." There it was, wrapped carefully in concern. Not I hurt you. Not I dismissed you. Not I am sorry for looking at you like you were in the way. Only the company, the employees, the families, all placed gently between Richard and the thing he wanted. Susan reached across the table just far enough to appear warm without risking rejection. Emily, I know we have not been close, but I always respected your devotion to Daniel. I should have said it more. We all should have. Emily looked at Susan's hand, then at her face. This was the same woman who had once told a group of guests that Emily was refreshingly simple, the same woman who complimented her dress by saying navy was a safe choice, the same woman who, 2 days earlier, had asked whether the funeral reception should use Daniel's favorite caterer because it would look better for the family. Now Susan's voice trembled with sudden tenderness. Emily understood exactly what Daniel had warned her about. Their kindness had arrived overnight, fully dressed and ready to perform, but it had not come from remorse. It had come from risk. Mr. Harris remained quiet, allowing the room to reveal itself. Emily finally picked up Daniel's letter. The paper felt heavier than it should have. She did not read all of it, only the first lines again, slowly, privately, letting his voice settle inside her. Do not confuse that change with love. Daniel had known them so well. He had known her too. He had known that her first instinct would be to make the room easier for everyone else, to protect even those who had not protected her, to hand them a gentler version of the truth so no one had to sit with shame too long. But he had also given her permission not to do that anymore. Emily set the letter down and looked at Mr. Harris. What happens if they sign the acknowledgments? She asked. Richard leaned forward too quickly. Margaret's shoulders lowered in relief before she could hide it. Mr. Harris answered, their conditional gifts remain available, but control of the estate and company remains with you. The acknowledgments do not reduce your authority. Emily nodded. And if they do not sign? Their gifts are transferred to the foundation. Susan swallowed. Richard looked toward Margaret, and in that brief glance Emily saw the truth more clearly than in any apology. They were not asking themselves what was right. They were calculating what refusal would cost. Margaret reached for Emily's hand, but Emily moved her hand gently to her lap. It was not dramatic. It was not cruel. It was simply the first boundary she had ever placed between them without apology. I will not make this decision today, Emily said. Richard opened his mouth, but Mr. Harris raised one hand. Mrs. Carter is under no obligation to respond immediately. Mrs. Carter. The name filled the room differently now. Not as a courtesy. Not as a technicality. As fact. Emily stood, holding Daniel's letter against her chest. The others stood too, as if her movement required their attention. For the first time, Margaret did not step in front of her. Richard did not speak over her. Susan did not correct her tone, her posture, or her place. Emily walked to the door, and every eye followed her, not because they loved her, not because they understood her, but because Daniel had made sure they could no longer afford to ignore her. Emily stepped out of Mr. Harris's office into the hallway with Daniel's letter held close to her chest, and for the first time since the funeral, she did not feel like she was walking away from something. She felt like she was walking toward the life Daniel had been trying to return to her. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and she entered alone before anyone from the Carter family could follow. As the doors closed, she saw Margaret still standing near the conference room, one hand at her throat, Richard speaking quickly to Susan, and Susan looking at Emily with an expression that was no longer pity. It was fear wrapped in politeness. Downstairs, the Chicago air was cold enough to sting, but Emily welcomed it. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment while taxis passed, while strangers hurried past her in wool coats, while the city continued as if Daniel Carter had not just reached from beyond silence and changed the shape of her future. She opened the letter again in the back seat of the car and read the rest only when she was ready. Daniel had written about their first apartment, the one with the noisy radiator and the kitchen drawer that never closed. He wrote about the nights they ate grilled cheese sandwiches because every spare dollar went into the company. He wrote that he had been proudest not of the towers, contracts, accounts, or headlines, but of the woman who never needed a spotlight to become the strongest part of his life. Near the end, he wrote, "Do not spend the rest of your days proving your worth to people who benefited from it and still pretended not to see it." Emily pressed the paper to her lap and looked out the window until the buildings blurred. Over the next 30 days, the Carter family changed exactly as Daniel predicted. Margaret sent a handwritten note calling Emily her daughter-in-law for the first time, but every sentence leaned carefully toward the Lake Forest house. Richard requested a meeting about stability, legacy, and shared responsibility, but attached a proposal that placed him close to power without naming his ambition. Susan invited Emily to lunch at a quiet restaurant near the Gold Coast and spoke warmly about healing, then mentioned that public misunderstandings could damage everyone involved. Emily answered none of them quickly. She worked with Mr. Harris, met with the board of Carter Development Group, and listened more than she spoke. The employees were nervous at first, expecting grief to make her uncertain. Instead, they found a woman who knew the company's history because she had lived inside its hardest years. She remembered which properties Daniel refused to sell because families depended on fair rent. She remembered which contractors had stood by him when larger firms walked away. She remembered the names of assistants, drivers, bookkeepers, and building managers whom Richard had never bothered to learn. 2 weeks after the will reading, Emily held her first official meeting as controlling owner. She wore a simple grey suit, Daniel's wedding ring on a chain beneath her blouse, and her own ring still on her hand. Richard attended, smiling too widely. Margaret did not come, but she sent flowers. Susan posted a tasteful message online about honoring Daniel's legacy and respecting Emily's strength. Emily saw it, closed the screen, and continued reviewing foundation documents. By the end of the month, all three signed the acknowledgements. Not because they had transformed overnight into better people, but because Daniel had made honesty the price of comfort. Emily accepted the signatures without celebration. She allowed Margaret to keep the Lake Forest house, but removed Richard from every advisory position that carried a title without responsibility. She funded the Emily Carter Foundation with more than Daniel had originally set aside, adding programs for caregivers who had given years of their lives without recognition. On the first anniversary of Daniel's passing, Emily returned to the maple tree outside their Evanston home. Its leaves had turned gold again, bright against the afternoon sky. She placed one hand on the trunk and thought about the young woman who had once arrived at the Carter house carrying an apple pie, hoping kindness would be enough to earn a place. She wished she could tell that woman the truth, the place had never been theirs to give. Daniel had loved her imperfectly, but in the end, he had told the truth perfectly. Emily did not become cruel. She did not become loud. She did not spend her life punishing people who had already been revealed by their own choices. She simply stopped shrinking so they could feel tall. And when Margaret called weeks later, speaking carefully, asking whether Emily might come to Thanksgiving dinner as family, Emily looked across the quiet kitchen where Daniel's photograph rested beside a vase of fresh flowers. Then she answered with the peace of a woman who finally understood her own value. "Thank you for inviting me," she said, "but this year, I am going where I have always been welcome."